In March of 1986, a 20-year-old man drove his car to the edge of the Maine woods, left the keys in the center console, and walked into the forest with nothing but basic supplies. He didn't come back for 27 years. While the world outside him underwent a digital revolution, the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the turn of a new millennium, Christopher lived in a state of near total isolation. He wasn't a survivalist in the traditional sense. He didn't hunt or forage for most of his food. Instead, he became a ghost in the North Pond community, committing over 1,000 tactical break-ins of nearby summer cabins to secure things he needed to survive the brutal winters. When he was finally captured in April of 2013, his reason for leaving society was as simple as it was profound. He just wanted to be alone. In 2017, journalist Michael Finkel published a book based on numerous interviews he'd had with Chris surrounding his life and time in the woods. Christopher's story made headlines and sparked debates. Could there really be hermits in 2013? What does it mean to turn your back on society? And what kind of punishment should someone like Christopher face? I'm Brooke, and this is a story of Christopher Thomas Knight, a man who decided to leave the world behind, becoming the last true hermit of the modern era. April 4th, 2013 was the last day Christopher Thomas Knight would spend living in the woods in central Maine, the place he called home for 27 years. Now, at the time he didn't know it, but his decision to break into the Pine Tree summer camp would be his undoing. You see, Christopher had spent the last 2 decades surviving by stealing from summer camps and seasonal cabins, taking just what he needed to live, things like food, clothing, propane tanks, and books to keep his mind occupied. Years ago, locals began referring to him as the North Pond Hermit. Now, typically, Christopher waited for a new moon to carry out his raids because it was darker, but his food situation had become dire. All he had left was a few crackers, some ground coffee, and a couple of packets of sweetener. He couldn't wait any longer. Using a screwdriver to pop the lock, Chris entered the Pine Ridge dining hall through the back door. Once inside, he began filling his backpack with supplies: 2 tubs of coffee, a bag of marshmallows, some tortellini, a breakfast bar, and potato chips. Then he made his way to the walk-in freezer using a spare key to unlock it. Inside the freezer, he grabbed hamburger patties, sausage, bacon, and blocks of cheese. Now, unbeknownst to Chris, he had accidentally tripped a hidden sensor in the dining hall, a sensor that alerted Game Warden Terry Hughes. See, Game Warden Hughes had made it his mission to find whoever was stealing from the locals and Pine Tree Camp and bring them to justice. For over 25 years, traditional police methods had failed to uncover the thief, and it wasn't for a lack of trying. Over the years, 2 county sheriff's department, the state police, and the game warden services all carried out periodic investigations, including foot searches, flyovers, and fingerprint dusting, all to no avail. They hadn't even managed to stir up a name. It wasn't until Game Warden Hughes had learned about new equipment being used by Border Patrol agents to uncover people attempting to sneak across borders that he knew he had found a solution. Sensors were placed behind the dining hall's ice machine and juice dispenser, and a monitor was installed in Game Warden Hughes' house. If the sensors were tripped, an alarm would go off. Now it was just a waiting game. 2 weeks later, in the early morning hours of April 4th, 2013, Chris had unknowingly tripped the hidden sensor in the Pine Tree dining hall. Within seconds, Game Warden Hughes was alerted, and he couldn't have been more ready. He went from being in bed to the Pine Tree dining hall in under 5 minutes. After confirming there was indeed someone in the dining hall, Game Warden Hughes alerted his colleague, State Trooper Diane Vance, to come handle the arrest. Then he positioned himself outside the only other exit in the dining hall and waited. Moments later, he watched the door open. The figure that stepped out of the dining hall was nothing like what Game Warden Hughes had pictured or expected. Everything about the man was at odds with itself. Here's the so-called North Pond Hermit, but he appeared clean and freshly shaven. He had on new-looking blue jeans and a nice Columbia jacket, but wore outdated glasses. His boots were in good condition, but he had no identification. His backpack was from L.L. Bean, but the money he had in his wallet was old and moldy. Game Warden Hughes shouted for the thief to get on the ground. The man complied and did as he was told without hesitation.
Soon as he stepped outside the door, I just turned, Game Warden, on the ground, show me your hands, and he immediately just dropped right to the ground.
After getting him handcuffed, Hughes and State Trooper Diane Vance took him back inside the dining hall. And while he listened to their every command, he didn't answer questions or make eye contact. After everything that just happened, he seemed calm, almost too calm. Game Warden Hughes wondered if the man had mental health issues. Officer Vance wondered if they had the right guy. Surely this clean, well-groomed man wasn't some hermit living in the woods. An hour and a half after making the arrest, they had a name: Christopher Thomas Knight. By the way the man talked, it was clear he hadn't spoken in a long while. Each word seemed clanky and hard to get out. The man knew his birth date, December 7th, 1965. But he couldn't recall his age without doing some math. When Officer Vance asked him his address, he said none. When she asked where his mail was sent, he said no mail. The man got no tax returns, received no disability checks, and had no vehicle and lived with no one. Finally, she asked him, "Where do you live?" Christopher replied, "The woods." After asking him for how long, he said decades. When pressed for a year, he had to think about it, asking Officer Vance what year the Chernobyl disaster occurred. She told him 1986. Chris said, "That's when I took to the woods." Now, because Chris had effectively stepped out of society 27 years ago, he didn't know the names of any of the places around him. He didn't know the name of the pond he frequently visited, nor did he know the name of the township he resided in, Rome. Could this man's story be real? How would he survive the long and brutal Maine winters? Christopher went on to tell Officer Vance that he stayed in a small nylon tent, never once lighting a fire for fear of attracting unwanted attention. Every autumn, he stockpiled food for the next 5 to 6 months, enough to last him until the snow melted and he could walk through the forest without leaving prints. He was noted to have scabs on his wrist. When asked what he did for medical treatment, he said that he took no medication nor went to a doctor since he hadn't ever suffered any serious injuries. And because he wasn't around people, he didn't get sick. After a while, it became hard to doubt his story. Christopher was surprisingly forthcoming and honest. He admitted to prying the dining hall door open with a screwdriver and using a key he had stolen years before to get into the freezer. But what about the money he had in his wallet? In total, there was $395. Christopher explained he had accumulated it over the years, taking a few bills here and there from places he had broken into. He figured there might come a time when he would have to go into town to buy something, but that hadn't happened. In fact, he said he spent no money the entire time he was in the woods. He estimated that he had broken into cabins and camps roughly 40 times a year. And over the course of 27 years, that brings the total to more than 1,000 separate break-ins. Naturally, Christopher became somewhat of an expert, and he followed a strict routine of only breaking into places at night after ensuring that nobody was there. He never stole from anybody's full-time residence, choosing to instead focus on cabins and the Pine Tree Camp. He said that sometimes the camps were unlocked, but if they weren't, he usually entered in through a window or forced open a door. Over the years, Christopher had amassed quite a stash. Almost everything he had was stolen. Everything from his break-in tools to the entirety of his campsite to the underwear he was wearing, telling Officer Vance, "The only thing I can honestly say is mine are my glasses." He was also asked about any family in the area. And while Christopher wasn't sure if his parents were dead or alive, he didn't want them contacted, saying that he was ashamed and that his parents didn't raise him to be a thief. Christopher revealed that he grew up in central Maine and graduated from Lawrence High School in 1984. A background check only further confirmed his story. He had no criminal record or prior arrests, and his driver's license expired back in 1987. Strangely enough, he wasn't even listed as a missing person. Chris estimated that the last time he had had an encounter with another human was sometime in the late 90s. While walking in the woods, he had passed a hiker and said hi, making that the only human interaction he had had in 27 years. For locals in the area, their missing items remained more of a mystery than a mugging. Things like flashlights, batteries, books, and knives would come up missing. Nothing collectively big enough that shouted theft. After all, their TVs, laptops, and valuables were untouched. It was more of a head-scratcher, like, where did all the batteries go? Who misplaced the flashlight? Some locals noticed signs of a break-in, an unlocked front door, a broken knob, a tampered window. It soon became evident that the primary target for the intruder was the Pine Tree Camp, a 285-acre campus dedicated to helping children and adults with physical and developmental disabilities enjoy the outdoors. People talk, and in a small town like Rome, word spreads faster. it was clear that the intruder was after specific items. First, people dubbed him the Mountain Man, then the Hungry Man, until eventually locals settled on calling him the North Pond Hermit, though nobody knew anything about the hermit. What if it was a woman? Perhaps there was more than one. Some speculated it was just teenagers. Maybe it was hunters from out of town. But at the end of the day, it didn't really matter who was doing it. The locals just wanted it to stop. Some families took to bargaining with the thief, taping notes on their front door that read things like, "Please don't break in. Tell us what you need and we'll leave it out for you." While others hung bags outside already filled with things. None of it worked. That's when locals began what they called hermit-proofing their cabins, installing motion lights, alarm system, and reinforcing their doors and windows. The thefts continued. Some families were stolen from so often that they began to notice patterns. The hermit seemed to prefer peanut butter over tuna fish, chose briefs over boxers, and wouldn't take food that was already opened. A string of break-ins would occur early in the lake season before Memorial Day, then another set in September after Labor Day. Otherwise, it was always midweek, usually on rainy nights. And of course, none of the full-time residents were ever targeted. This went on for 10 long years, eventually becoming more akin to a folklore legend. Was the hermit in your neck of the woods? Was he standing in the dark, watching, waiting? At the turn of the 21st century, the thefts were still occurring. At a homeowners meeting in 2004, the 100 or so people present were asked who had experienced break-ins. At least 75 raised their hands. It had been 18 years since all of this had started, and frustrations were at an all-time high. When was this going to end? It wasn't until one of the families caught something on a hidden motion-activated security camera that locals would get their first glimpse of the North Pond Hermit, and they couldn't have been more confused. Cameras captured a man peering into a refrigerator. But instead of seeing a scary hermit, they saw a clean, well-dressed man. A man who didn't appear at all to be roughing it in the woods. One person even called him Mr. Ordinary. Images of the man were hung around town. Officers even went from cabin to cabin hoping that somebody could identify him. Nobody could. And the break-ins continued. Pretty soon, another decade had passed. Wanting answers, one man spent 2 summers hiding out in his cabin in the dark for a week, waiting for the hermit to break in. He never did. Because this had been going on for 20 years, most started to believe that the original thief was dead, and in his place was a copycat. Some of the locals even reconciled with the idea that this was just how things were going to be. Just replace some lost things over the summer and move on. The cost of doing business in the area. Justice wouldn't come for another 7 years, until April 4th, 2013, when Christopher was arrested, charged with burglary and theft, and transported to the Kennebec County Correctional Facility, where, for the first time in more than 25 years, he slept indoors. Christopher's story elicited strong responses. Phone calls and letters came pouring into the jail. Everything from marriage proposals to cash to land to live on. Some even tried to post his bail. After it was decided that Christopher was a flight risk, his bail was raised to $250,000. The media believed he had a story to tell. Journalists from all over the world attempted to contact him, as did TV shows and filmmakers. But Christopher had nothing to say, and he declined anything that was sent to him. 2 months after his arrest, he was ready to talk. Through a series of back-and-forth letters with journalist Mike Finkel, he revealed that while he didn't like jail, he deserved to be there, saying, "I stole. I was a thief. I repeatedly stole over many years. I knew it was wrong. Knew it was wrong, felt guilty about it every time, yet continued to do it." Christopher found it extremely difficult to adapt to being incarcerated. He hadn't spoken to anyone in years, and when he did attempt to talk with other inmates, he found he had little to relate to. Eventually, Christopher gave up trying. Not only that, he found it difficult to deal with the noise, the people, the filthy conditions, and the lack of darkness, saying, "I suspect more damage has been done to my sanity in jail in months than years, decades in the woods." Through his letters with Mike, he revealed that there were a number of winters he barely survived. And when times were tough, he meditated, saying, "I didn't meditate every day, month, season in the woods, just when death was near." Incredibly, Christopher lived in the same campsite for almost his entire time in the woods. A hidden spot roughly 20 foot by 20 foot that was situated on a 220-acre parcel of land with just one year-round house on it. And while it was easy to imagine his site was out in the middle of nowhere, that wasn't exactly true. In fact, the nearest cabin to his hiding spot was just a few minutes' walk. It was almost like Christopher was hidden in plain sight. The woods around his camp was extremely dense, almost disorienting, and huge boulders scattered the area, making navigating the terrain even more difficult. In the summers, the area was teeming with mosquitoes and poison ivy, and in the winter, snow piled up there, leading locals to avoid that patch of forest altogether. Game Warden Hughes said, "If he wouldn't have shown us his site, we probably never would have found it." Christopher's setup was extremely meticulous. In an interior living area, underneath an old carpet, he had created a subflooring using stacks of old magazines and electrical tape that went at least a foot deep. This gave him a level floor and helped drain rainwater. The walls of his home were constructed with green and brown plastic tarps and several large black garbage bags, forming an A-frame structure that was roughly 10 feet tall and 12 feet long. One entrance to his structure led to a kitchen containing a Coleman 2-burner camp stove placed on top of milk crates with the garden hose connecting the stove to a propane tank. Cooking supplies were hung from ropes along the kitchen walls: a frying pan, a pot, a strainer, a spatula, and a cup. At the other end of the structure was Christopher's bedroom, a dome-shaped camping tent placed within the A-frame for added protection against the elements. Inside the tent, he had a twin-size mattress and box spring on a metal bed frame, with wooden blocks under each leg to prevent them from tearing holes in the tent floor. He kept his clothes in plastic tubs and used milk crates to hold things like books, flashlights, portable radios, and watches. He even had a wash area on site complete with soap, shampoo, and laundry detergent, though he hadn't had a warm shower in more than 25 years. Christopher also had a dedicated area for collecting water. Using a tarp attached to 4 trees, he'd collect rainwater and store it in plastic 30-gallon garbage cans, making sure to keep 60 to 90 gallons on hand at all times. When that water got dirty, he'd strain it through coffee filters before drinking it. And when the water inevitably turned green and scaly, he'd use it for laundry and bathing. An area at the far end of the camp was designated as the bathroom, a few logs surrounding an open pit. Another area was dedicated to his trash disposal. One section held things like old propane tanks and mattresses. In another area, Chris had dug a large hole in the ground for food containers and wrappers. Officials found dozens of macaroni and cheese boxes, baked bean containers, canned ravioli, packaging from graham crackers, goldfish, Cool Whip, Mountain Dew, and Country Time lemonade. Now, Chris said he tried not to throw most things away. You never know when something might come in handy. Using trees around his camp as storage, he'd secure items to them by wrapping rope around the trunks. Some trees held tools and shovels, while others held scissors, cord, wire, and glue. It was clear that Christopher had quite an elaborate setup. So, who was he before answering the call of the wild? Prior to Christopher leaving society and walking into the woods, he wasn't some kind of nature enthusiast or bushcrafter. In fact, he'd never even slept in a tent. Chris is the second youngest child out of 6 born to Joyce and Sheldon Knight. And from the outside looking in, they appeared to be your all-American family. They lived in a 2-story farmhouse on 60 acres, spending their days tending to a large family garden, chopping wood, and building things. Nights were spent reading, with one family friend saying that the inside of their house resembled a library. Former high school teachers and classmates all described the Knight children as extremely intelligent, with one referring to them as a family of brainiacs. In fact, education and self-improvement were cornerstones of their family. The Knights were into gardening and homesteading, studying thermodynamics and horticulture. They even built a sophisticated greenhouse that allowed them to grow vegetables all winter long. For the most part, they kept to themselves, with neighbors describing them as introverts who were quiet, respectful, and self-sufficient. People who knew Chris as a child said he was quiet, shy, a little nerdy, but nothing that seemed off. One man who went to elementary, junior, and high school with Chris said, "I didn't find him to be all that weird. He was a wicked smart kid and he had a really good sense of humor." Chris said in high school he felt invisible. He didn't play sports, join clubs, or go to after-school events, though he did have 2 or 3 good friends. And while Chris did a little hunting and fishing, he was really into computers, with his senior yearbook listing his future plans to become a computer technician. In fact, after graduating, Chris enrolled in a 9-month electronics course at Sylvania Technical School just outside of Boston. Afterwards, he found a job installing home and vehicle alarm systems. For all intents and purposes, Chris was on a typical life path. He was renting a room in a house and even bought a new car, a white 1985 Subaru Brat that one of his brothers helped co-sign for. Then one day, less than a year after starting his new job, Chris quit without notice. He didn't even bother returning his work tools. Instead, he cashed his last paycheck and skipped town, telling no one where he was going. After cashing his final paycheck, Chris got in his car and headed south, telling no one, not even his family, that he was leaving. Chris said, "I had no one to tell. I didn't have any friends. I had no interest in my coworkers." Chris drove for days, staying in cheap motels and eating fast food until he eventually found himself in Florida. Not long after, he turned around and began heading north. It was on the drive back to Maine that an idea began to formulate in Chris's mind. And instead of going home to his parents, he kept driving, going as far into the wilderness as his car would take him, saying, "I drove until I was nearly out of gas. I took a small road. Then I took a small road off that small road. Then a trail off that." At just 20 years old, Chris parked his car, left his keys in the console, and stepped into the forest with nothing more than a backpack and a tent. So, what drove Chris to do this? Sure, his family was strict, but they weren't overly rigid. He had a few friends in high school and seemed close with at least two of his brothers. He was smart, had a good job, a brand new car, and was even one of the early adopters of personal computers. Surprisingly, Chris couldn't fully answer that question himself, saying there wasn't one specific thing he could point to. Nothing like trauma, abuse, violence, something he needed to hide. "I can't explain my actions," he said. "I had no plans when I left. I wasn't thinking of anything. I just did it." Once in the woods, Chris headed south, carrying a few basic camp supplies, some clothes, and a little food. He would camp in one spot for a week or so at a time, then pack up and keep heading south. Chris discovered that, for the most part, he really liked what he was doing. There was just one problem: food. He couldn't find much in the way of foraging for food, and he didn't have a fishing pole or gun. After exhausting what little food he had with him, he resorted to eating roadkill. But not having a fire or stove, he ate it raw. After a while, Chris broke down and started taking vegetables from houses he passed that had gardens. One time early on in his trip, he spent the night in an empty cabin, but said that the fear of getting caught was too stressful. After that, he made the decision to never sleep indoors again, no matter how cold or rainy it got. Chris continued heading south until he stumbled on an area with 2 lakes and cabins scattered around them. There was even a summer camp nearby. Now, he didn't know it at the time, but he was less than 30 miles from his childhood home. Chris liked the area, but he couldn't find a suitable spot to set up camp. Over the next few months, he trialed out different places, but none of them were right. Then he found a dense patch of forest with big boulders. He liked it. Now that Chris had found a permanent home base, he needed to figure out what to do about food. He had been taking from local gardens, but that wouldn't work in the fall and winter. Chris noticed that the cabins around the pond were for the most part unsecured, and with few year-round residents, the area would soon clear out. His plan was to take what he needed from vacant cottages, but he knew he needed to be smart about it. Christopher said he carefully observed the residents of North Pond, watching their patterns and learning their schedules. Once he got those down, it became a matter of timing. There were more than 100 cabins in his rotation he shuffled through. As the residents of North Pond invested in security upgrades, Chris adapted, using what he learned about alarms from his previous job. Sometimes he disabled systems, other times he removed memory cards from visible cameras. In none of the situations did he enjoy what he was doing, saying, "Every time I was very conscious that I was doing wrong. I took no pleasure in it, none at all. My adrenaline was spiking, my heart rate was soaring, my blood pressure was high. I was always scared when stealing, always. I wanted it over as quickly as possible." Despite being in the woods all those years and breaking into cabins, Chris never once suffered any kind of injury, illness, accident, or cold, not even a rash from the local poison ivy. His biggest concern was his failing eyesight. He'd had poor vision since childhood and was meticulous about protecting his glasses while living in the woods, saying, "I knew if I broke my glasses, that would be it." Over the years, his eyesight continued to decline, until eventually everything beyond arm's reach became blurry. Despite trying on every pair of glasses he came across during break-ins, he never found a better prescription. Besides his failing eyesight, his teeth continually hurt. And while he had a toothbrush and toothpaste, it wasn't enough to make up for the types of food he was eating. When Chris wasn't out raiding, he stayed in his camp, filling his time with chores, maintenance upkeep, and entertainment. He loved reading anything from poetry to military history. Using portable radios and earbuds, he'd listen to talk radio, classical music, and his favorite, classical rock. For a while, he watched TV on a stolen 5-inch diagonal television, using stolen car and boat batteries to power it. After burning through all of his batteries during the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks, he never watched TV again, saying that it was too difficult carrying those large batteries. Then he got a radio that received television audio signals. This allowed him to listen to TV shows like Seinfeld and Everybody Loves Raymond. He also enjoyed playing handheld video games like Pokemon and Tetris. Chris said he actually spent the majority of his time in quiet contemplation, daydreaming, meditating, thinking, and he was never once bored at all in his time out there, he said. His busiest time of year was when residents began shutting down their cabins for the off-season. This is when Chris began making his winter preparations, going on all-night raids and upping his intake of sugar and alcohol in order to gain weight and add on extra fat. He stockpiled clothes, non-perishable food, and propane tanks, typically burning through 10 every winter. Not wanting to risk leaving tracks in the snow, from November to April, he tried to never leave his camp. During the winter months, he grew out a beard to protect his face from the cold and slept under multiple layers of sleeping bags. He said that no matter what he tried, though, he could never keep his feet warm. During the coldest time of year, he followed a strict schedule, going to bed at 7:30 p.m. and sleeping until 2 a.m. That way, during the coldest times, he was awake. From there, he'd light his stove and start melting snow to drink. To get his blood circulating, he'd walk the perimeter of his site over and over. Then he'd air out his sleeping bag and shovel any snow out of his camp. This was all in an effort to keep him from dying of hypothermia. After his arrest, he was examined by a forensic psychologist hired by the state to evaluate his mental health. Court documents show that the state considered him to have complete competency and offered 3 possibilities: Asperger's, depression, or schizoid personality disorder. Multiple clinical psychologists reviewed Chris's story. None could come to an agreement, with one saying, "Nothing makes complete sense. The complexity of this guy is so puzzling, you could go anywhere diagnostically." Then there were others who doubted Chris's story altogether. A local man named Fred King said, "There's no way this guy was a hermit. I'm an outdoorsman and I'm just telling you, flat out, no way. I'm 1,000% sure. In winter, it's sub-zero all the time. I think a family member helped him or another person took him in, or he broke into vacant places and stayed all winter." But Chris was adamant. In the 27 years he had been in the woods, he hadn't received any help, wasn't in contact with friends or family, nor did he stay indoors, other than that one night he stayed in an empty cabin when he first left. In fact, he said the first time he had used an actual toilet in more than 2 decades was at the Kennebec County Jail. State Trooper Diane Vance believed Chris, as did Game Warden Hughes, saying during one conference, "There's no doubt in my mind he's lived out there the whole time." Chris said there were times he occasionally missed his family, but for the most part they weren't on his mind. And there were times he contemplated leaving the woods and going home, but those thoughts mainly occurred during his first 10 years in the woods. He also had an emergency system in place should he need help. In his tent was a whistle he could use to signal others to come looking. But at the end of the day, Chris truly had no intentions of voluntarily leaving the woods. Ever. In fact, he said he was prepared to die out there. While incarcerated, Chris learned that his father, Sheldon, had died in 2001, but his mother, Joyce, who was in her 80s, was still alive. And while he eventually consented to law enforcement notifying his mother that he had been found, he wouldn't allow her to visit him in the jail, saying, "Look at me, I'm in my prison clothes. I couldn't let her see me like this. I'm a thief, I'm in jail, guilty of so many crimes. This is not something my mom raised me to be. This is no place for her." He did, however, accept a single visit from 2 of his brothers. His brothers said they'd often wondered what had happened to Chris. They figured he was dead, but never wanted to give up hope that he was somewhere living his life, probably in another state. When asked why nobody in his family called the authorities or reported him missing, Chris said, "They assumed I was off doing something on my own, having an adventure. We Yankees see the world differently." Local authorities weren't even that surprised to learn that the Knights didn't report their son missing. They're a rural Maine family. They're a very keep-to-themselves family. If a boy went off, then he went off. They were worried about him, I'm sure, but they didn't involve the authorities. That wasn't the ethos of that. On Monday, October 28, 2013, 7 months after his arrest, Chris pled guilty to 13 counts of burglary and theft. He was sentenced to 7 months in jail, which at the time he had served all but a week of while he was awaiting sentencing. Instead of prison time, he agreed to attend co-occurring disorders, a program designed to help individuals with mental health disorders and substance abuse problems. He also had to complete 3 years of probation and was fined $2,000 to be distributed to his victims. But Chris didn't necessarily see this as a victory. After being taken from the woods and immediately going to jail, the idea of rejoining society was overwhelming. Chris said, "I have no preparation for re-entry into society. I don't know your world. Only my world and memories of the world before I went to the woods. What is life today? What is proper? There are blank spots in my skill set. I have to figure out how to live." After being released from jail, Chris went to live with his mother and got a job dismantling engines for his oldest brother's scrap metal recycling business. And while Chris didn't get paid, he worked in exchange for room and board. This allowed him to fulfill his employment requirement, and he could work out of his family's shed and avoid social interactions. Chris fulfilled all of his requirements set forth by the courts. He completed counseling sessions, community service, and all of his court-ordered check-ins. But life post-Forest was hard for him. Since his early 20s, he had had complete autonomy, but now at almost 50 years old, he couldn't even make his own decisions. And whenever he opened up to the judge, his therapist, or family about his struggles, nothing any of them said helped. All Chris wanted to do was return to his camp. Reactions to Chris's story range from shock and awe to anger and disgust. On one hand, he did something that so many of us have thought of doing, leaving society and dropping off the face of the earth. But on the other hand, he was still using society to survive. Not only did he steal items, but he stole people's sense of security. Is it even possible to live completely alone without help from others? For a few months after his release from jail, journalist Mike Finkel kept up with him to see how he was doing. Mike had said in his book that Christopher was having a hard time reintegrating into society and wasn't happy. All he wanted to do was go back to the woods. Unfortunately, and unsurprisingly, there aren't many updates on how Christopher is doing to this day. It's said he's still alive and would be in his 60s. If you're interested in learning even more about Christopher and his story, I highly recommend checking out Mike Finkel's book. Now, I pass the question off to you. Had you heard about Christopher and his story before today's video? I remember hearing about it back in 2013 and being shocked that somebody was still out in the wild living for all those years. It's hard to be mad at somebody who did what so many of us have thought about doing before, dropping everything and running away from society. But on the other hand, he was still reliant on society for his survival. I don't know, let me know your thoughts in the comments below and how long you think you could last surviving in the wild. If you enjoyed today's video, give it a thumbs up, and hey, while you're at it, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss out on the next investigation.